The October wind carried dust and dead leaves through the main street of Dustwell, Wyoming, as Caroline Ruth Gentry rode into town on a horse that looked as tired as she felt. The animal's ribs showed through its dull coat, and its head hung low with each weary step. Caroline's own appearance wasn't much better. Her brown traveling dress was faded from too many washings and mended in places where the fabric had worn thin. A worn leather satchel hung from her saddle, containing everything she owned in this world. She was 29 years old, though the lines around her gray eyes made her look older. Those eyes had seen too much battlefield hospitals during the border conflicts. Men crying for their mothers as infection took hold. Women giving birth with no doctor for miles. Her hands, now gripping the reins, bore the calluses of hard work and the stains of countless herbal preparations. Dustwell stretched before her like a collection of wooden boxes dropped carelessly on the prairie. The buildings leaned against each other as if seeking support, their unpainted boards weathered to the color of old bones. A single church steeple rose above the rest, its cross tilted at an angle that suggested even God might be having second thoughts about this place. Caroline pulled her horse to a stop in front of what appeared to be the general store. A few men lounged on the wooden walkway, their conversations dying as they took in the sight of her. She could read their thoughts in their expressions. A woman alone, no wedding ring, riding a half-dead horse. The calculations were quick and dismissive. "Afternoon," she said, touching the brim of her hat. One of the men, a portly fellow with tobacco stains on his vest, spat into the street. "Afternoon, ma'am. You lost—" "No, sir, looking for lodging." The men exchanged glances, and a younger one with sandy hair smirked. "Widow Murphy runs the boarding house, 2 buildings down, though I doubt she's got room for travelers." The pause before travelers told Caroline everything she needed to know about how quickly news would spread. By sunset, everyone in Dustwell would know about the woman who rode in alone, looking like something the cat dragged in. She guided her horse down the street, aware of the eyes following her progress. The boarding house was easy to spot. It had lace curtains in the windows and a sign that read, "Murphy's Respectable Lodging," in faded green paint. Caroline tied her horse to the post and climbed the steps, her boots making hollow sounds on the wood. The door opened before she could knock. A woman in her 50s stood there, her face pinched with suspicion. This had to be Widow Murphy. Her black dress was spotless, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin of her forehead. "Help you?" "I'd like a room. Ma'am, I can pay." Caroline reached for the small purse in her pocket, knowing it held barely enough for a week's lodging. Widow Murphy's eyes traveled from Caroline's dusty boots to her uncovered head. Her hat had blown off somewhere on the trail, and she hadn't bothered to retrieve it. "This is a respectable establishment. I don't take in just anyone." "I'm respectable enough. I'm a nurse, trained in—" "A nurse?" The widow's tone made it sound like Caroline had confessed to being a saloon dancer. "And where's your husband?" "I'm not married." "Family?" "Dead." The door began to close. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. Try the saloon. Sometimes Blackjack lets folks sleep in his storeroom." Caroline stood on the porch for a moment after the door shut in her face. She'd expected this, but it still stung. In the territories, an unmarried woman without family was either a burden or a temptation, and neither was welcome in respectable society. She led her horse around to the back of the church, where she'd noticed an old shed that might have once housed carriages. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and daylight showed through gaps in the walls. But it was better than sleeping under the stars with winter coming on. Inside, she found evidence that others had used this shelter before her: a pile of old straw in one corner, a broken chair, and scratches on the wall that might have been someone counting days. Caroline unsaddled her horse and hobbled it where it could reach the sparse grass behind the building. Then she spread her one good blanket on the straw and sat down to take inventory of her situation. Her medical supplies were running low. She had some willow bark for fever, a handful of dried comfrey for wounds, and precious little else. Her food consisted of hardtack and dried beans. She had $17.43 to her name, the remnants of payment from the last family she'd helped through scarlet fever. As darkness fell, she heard the church bells ring the hour, 6 o'clock. Through the gaps in the wall, she could see lights beginning to glow in the windows of Dustwell. Families sitting down to dinner. She imagined children saying grace, wives serving stew, husbands talking about the day's work, all the normal things that normal people did, in their normal lives that had no room for a woman like her. She pulled her blanket tighter and closed her eyes, trying not to think about how cold it would get before morning. In her satchel, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small daguerreotype, the only image she had of herself from before the war, before she'd learned to set bones and treat fever, before she'd held a soldier's hand as he died calling for his Sarah. In the picture, she was 19, wearing a new dress, smiling at something beyond the camera's range. She couldn't remember what she'd been looking at. She couldn't remember being that young. A scratching at the door made her sit up, hand going instinctively to the small knife she kept in her boot. But it was only a dog, a thin yellow mongrel with one ear torn from some old fight. The animal looked at her with the same wariness she'd shown it, then crept inside and curled up near the door, as far from her as it could get while still being under shelter. "Smart dog," Caroline murmured. "Keep your distance, but take what comfort you can find." The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose boards and bringing the smell of coming rain. Caroline pulled out her journal, another luxury she couldn't afford to replace, and wrote by the last light filtering through the walls. October the 15th. Arrived in Dustwell. No lodging available for an unmarried woman without references. Sleeping in shed behind Methodist church. Horse is failing. Will need to find work soon or sell him for meat. Town seems prosperous enough but closed to outsiders. Will try to find work tomorrow. Must remember, I chose this life. No one forced me to leave Illinois. No one told me to come west. This is freedom, even if it tastes like dust and loneliness. She closed the journal and lay back on the straw. Tomorrow she would walk through town with her head high, looking for someone who needed what she could offer. There were always sick children, always women struggling through difficult births, always men too proud to admit they needed help until infection set in. She just had to last long enough for someone to overcome their suspicion and let her help. The yellow dog whined softly in its sleep, chasing rabbits in its dreams. Caroline understood. Everyone was chasing something. Comfort, safety, belonging. The difference was that some folks had a warm bed to dream in, while others made do with whatever shelter they could find. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard voices from the church choir practice. From the sound of it, they were singing, "Shall We Gather at the River?" and the familiar melody made her throat tight with some emotion she couldn't name. She'd sung that hymn once, in a proper church, wearing a proper dress, back when she'd believed that goodness was rewarded and virtue was its own protection. Now she knew better. Now she knew that virtue was just another word for the choices you made when no one was watching. And goodness was what you did when it would have been easier to be cruel. And sometimes, protection was nothing more than a broken shed and a wild dog keeping watch at the door. The rain started just after midnight, drumming on the roof and dripping through in a dozen places. Caroline shifted her blanket to the driest spot she could find and tried to ignore the cold seeping through the thin walls. By morning, she would need to decide, try another town, or stay and fight for a place here. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, she had shelter of a sort, and that was more than some folks had. She'd learned to be grateful for small mercies, because sometimes they were the only kind available. The yellow dog crept closer as the night grew colder, until it was pressed against her feet. Caroline didn't push it away. Outcasts. She'd learned, couldn't afford to be choosy about their companions. The morning came too soon, bringing with it a cold that cut through Caroline's thin blanket like a blade. She woke to find frost on the walls of the shed and the yellow dog gone, leaving only a warm spot where it had lain. Her joints protested as she stood, stiff from sleeping on the ground. But she'd endured worse. She always had. After tending to her horse, the poor beast deserved whatever comfort she could provide. Caroline made her way to the creek that ran behind the church. The water was icy enough to steal her breath, but she washed her face and hands, then attempted to make her hair presentable. Appearances mattered, especially when you had little else to recommend you. She was gathering dried wood for a small fire when she heard it, the thunder of hooves and the bellowing of cattle. A herd was moving somewhere beyond the rise, probably heading to the railroad depot she'd passed 20 miles back. The sounds of the drive carried on the windmen shouting, whips cracking, the constant rumble of hundreds of animals moving as one. Caroline had just managed to coax a small flame from her gathered sticks when she heard something different, a horse's scream, high and panicked, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Then silence. She stood, listening. The main herd had moved on, but she heard no voices calling out, no sound of anyone going back to check. Cowboys didn't usually abandon their own, which meant either no one had noticed, or the fallen rider was alone, perhaps scouting ahead or riding drag behind the herd. Caroline grabbed her medical satchel and headed toward the sound. It took her 20 minutes of walking through the rough grassland before she found him. The man lay crumpled on the ground like a discarded doll, his horse standing nearby with reins trailing. Blood seeped from a gash on his temple, and his left leg was bent at an angle that made Caroline's stomach clench. She'd seen enough broken bones to recognize a bad one. She knelt beside him, fingers going to his throat to check for a pulse, strong and steady. Thank God. His skin was warm but not feverish, and his breathing was regular if shallow. She examined the head wound first, messy but not deep. Head wounds always bled like the devil, but often looked worse than they were. The leg was another matter. Even through his worn leather chaps and denim pants, she could see the swelling. Broken, certainly, but she'd need to examine it properly to know how badly. "Sir," she patted his cheek gently. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered. His eyes, when they opened, were the color of sage honey, clouded with pain and confusion. He tried to sit up, then groaned and fell back. "Don't move," Caroline ordered, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "You've had a fall. I'm here to help." "Who?" His voice was rough, dry. "Who are you?" "Caroline Gentry. I am a nurse. Now lie still while I examine you." He blinked up at her, seeming to have trouble focusing. "Angel?" "Hardly." She opened her satchel and pulled out her precious supplies. "This is going to hurt. I need to check your leg." The man, he looked to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble, gritted his teeth as she carefully felt along his leg. Definitely broken, but a clean break from what she could tell. It would heal straight if set properly. "What's your name?" she asked, partly to distract him from the pain and partly because she needed to know who she was helping. "Emmett," he managed through clenched teeth. "Emmett Lyles." "Well, Mr. Lyles, you've broken your leg. I'm going to need to set it, but first we need to get you somewhere sheltered. Can you ride if I help you mount?" He tried to laugh, but it came out as more of a wheeze. "Lady, I can't even think straight, much less ride." Caroline looked around, assessing her options. She couldn't leave him here, and she couldn't move him alone. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, stood patient nearby, if she could fashion a travois. It took her an hour to rig up a crude drag using branches and her own blanket. Emmett drifted in and out of consciousness as she worked, occasionally muttering things that didn't make sense. Something about missing cattle and a letter he needed to send. "This is going to hurt," she warned when she was ready to move him. "Can't hurt worse than it already does," he said, then promptly proved himself wrong by nearly passing out when she helped him onto the makeshift stretcher. The journey back to the shed seemed endless. Caroline led Emmett's horse while her own followed behind, and every bump and dip in the ground drew a grunt of pain from her patient. By the time she reached the church, The sun was high and her back ached from the effort. Getting him inside the shed was another challenge, but she managed it, settling him on the straw where she'd slept the night before. His face had gone gray with pain, and sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool air. "I need to set that leg," she said. "Do you have any whiskey?" "Saddlebags," he mumbled. She found a flask, nearly full. Good. She'd need him as relaxed as possible for what came next. While he took several long pulls from the flask, she gathered what she needed: straight sticks for splints, strips torn from her petticoat for bandages, and the small bottle of laudanum she'd been saving for a true emergency. "This is going to hurt worse than anything," she said, meeting his eyes. "I won't lie to you about that, but if I don't set it properly, you'll be lame for life." He nodded, understanding. Had worse. She doubted that, but didn't argue. Instead, she gave him a piece of leather to bite down on and positioned herself at his leg. On 3, 1, 2. The sound of bone grinding back into place was drowned out by his muffled scream. His body went rigid, then limp, and she was grateful he'd passed out. It made splinting the leg easier, and she worked quickly, binding it tight with practiced efficiency. When she'd finished with his leg, she cleaned the head wound, stitching it closed with careful sutures. His other injuries were minor bruised ribs, scraped hands, a wrenched shoulder. Nothing that wouldn't heal with time and rest. He woke as she was covering him with his own bedroll, which she'd retrieved from his saddle. "Still here." His voice was weak but coherent. "Where else would I go?" She helped him take another sip from the flask. "You're stuck with me for a while, Mr. Lyles. That leg needs to stay immobile for at least 6 weeks." 6 weeks. He tried to sit up, then thought better of it. "I can't. The drive." "The drive's gone on without you. I heard it pass this morning." His face crumpled with something that might have been despair. "They'll think I'm dead, or a deserter." "You nearly were dead. As for the other, I'm sure they'll understand when you catch up to them." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those honey-colored eyes. "Why did you help me? You don't know me from Adam." Caroline sat back on her heels, considering the question. "Someone needed help. I knew how to provide it. Sometimes it's as simple as that." "Nothing's that simple." "Maybe not," she agreed, "but it's what I choose to believe." He closed his eyes, exhaustion overtaking him. Within minutes, his breathing had evened out into sleep. Caroline watched him for a moment, this stranger she'd taken responsibility for. His face, relaxed in sleep, was younger than she'd first thought. There were laugh lines around his eyes and weather lines everywhere else. The map of a life lived outdoors. She'd need supplies to care for him properly. Medicine for the pain, food for them both, grain for the horses, which meant she'd need to venture into town and hope someone would be willing to sell to her. But first, she needed to think. She'd just saddled herself with an injured cowboy in a town that had already rejected her. The sensible thing would be to alert someone. Surely he had friends who'd come for him. But something held her back. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at her, without the suspicion or dismissal she'd grown accustomed to. Or maybe it was simpler than that. She was lonely, and caring for someone gave her purpose. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of Dustwell waking up. Wagon wheels on dirt streets, hammers ringing from the blacksmith's shop, children calling to each other, all the sounds of a life going on without her. She checked on Emmett once more. His color was better, and his pulse was steady. Then steeled herself for a trip to the general store. She had $17 to make last, and now 2 people and 2 horses to provide for. The yellow dog was back, she noticed, watching her from across the yard. "Don't suppose you know any wealthy patrons looking for a nurse?" she asked it. The dog tilted its head, then went back to scratching for fleas. Caroline took that as a no. As she walked toward town, she wondered what she'd gotten herself into. But then, she'd been wondering that since the day she'd left Illinois, with nothing but determination and a head full of medical knowledge that proper ladies weren't supposed to have. At least now she had a patient. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The general store was crowded when Caroline entered, her worn boots quiet on the plank floor. Conversation stuttered to a halt as the townsfolk took in her presence. She recognized some faces from yesterday. The tobacco-stained man, now examining a display of pipe tobacco, and two women in calico dresses who immediately put their heads together to whisper. Caroline kept her chin up and approached the counter where a thin man with steel-rimmed spectacles was measuring out flour. "Morning, sir. I need some supplies." The storekeeper, his name was Aldrich, according to the sign outside, looked her over with the calculating gaze of a man who extended credit carefully. Cash only. "I have cash." She pulled out her small purse, letting him see the bills inside. "I need laudanum. Carbolic acid if you have it, clean bandages, salt pork, beans, flour, and grain for 2 horses. His eyebrows rose. That's a considerable order for a woman traveling alone. "I'm caring for an injured man," she said, seeing no point in deception. "He's recovering in the old shed behind the church." The whispering increased, spreading through the store like wildfire. Aldrich's expression grew stern. "The shed's not for habitation. That's church property." "Then perhaps the church elders should speak to me about it. In the meantime, a man needs care. Will you fill my order or not?" He hesitated, then began gathering her items with obvious reluctance. The price he quoted was highway robbery, nearly double what the goods were worth. But Caroline paid without complaint. She'd expected as much. She was loading her purchases into a borrowed basket when one of the women approached her. Middle-aged, with a pinched face and suspicious eyes, she planted herself in Caroline's path. "You're the woman who was turned away from the boarding house yesterday." "I am." "And now you claim to have a man in that shed." "I don't claim anything. I found Mr. Lyle's injured on the prairie this morning. His leg is broken. I'm a trained nurse, so I'm caring for him until he can travel." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Unchaperoned, unmarried, have you no shame?" Caroline felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "I have a duty to help those in need. If you find that shameful, perhaps you should examine your own conscience." She pushed past the woman and out of the store, but she could feel the eyes following her, hear the buzzing of gossip rising like disturbed bees. By noon, everyone in Dustwell would know about the fallen woman playing nurse to a stranger in the church shed. Emmett was awake when she returned, trying unsuccessfully to sit up against the wall. His face was pale but determined, jaw set against the pain. "You should be lying flat," Caroline said, setting down her supplies. "Can't stay on my back forever," he grunted. "Besides, necessary." She understood immediately and felt foolish for not thinking of it sooner. "Let me help." "I can manage." "No, you can't. Not with that leg. Don't be prideful. I've dealt with far worse in the medical tents." It took some maneuvering and significant discomfort on his part, but they managed. When he was settled again, propped against the wall with folded blankets behind him, he looked at her with something like wonder. "You really were a war nurse?" "Among other things." She busied herself with preparing a simple meal. "I've set bones, delivered babies, treated everything from pneumonia to gunshot wounds. A broken leg is relatively straightforward." "Why aren't you working in a hospital somewhere?" "Hospitals prefer male doctors and married nurses. I'm neither." He was quiet as she worked, watching her efficient movements. She could feel his gaze like a physical thing, curious but not improper. "I can pay you," he said suddenly. "Not much, but when the drive's done, I'll have wages coming. $30 a month, and found I could give you half. Keep your money. You'll need it to get back on your feet." She handed him a plate of beans and salt pork. "Eat slowly. Your body's been through a shock." They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the scraping of spoons on tin plates and the wind rattling the loose boards. When they'd finished, Emmett shifted uncomfortably. "This arrangement, it's not proper. You shouldn't be here, caring for a stranger. What will people say?" "They're already saying it. I heard plenty at the store." Caroline collected the plates and set them aside. "But what would you have me do? Leave you here alone? You can't even stand without help." "There must be someone in town." "Who? The good wives who whisper about me, the men who look at me like I'm something for sale. Face it, Mr. Lyles, you're stuck with the fallen woman no one else wants around." He frowned. "Don't talk about yourself that way." "I'm only repeating what others say." "Then they're fools." His vehemence surprised them both. He colored slightly and looked away. "I mean, you saved my life. That makes you an angel in my book, no matter what anyone says." Caroline felt an unexpected warmth at his words. It had been a long time since anyone had defended her, even in such a small way. "Save your poetry for someone who needs it. I'm just a practical woman doing a practical job." But as the afternoon wore on and she tended to his needs, checking the leg, administering laudanum for the pain, helping him eat, she found herself oddly content. It was good to have purpose again, to use her skills for something other than her own survival. Word of their arrangement spread quickly. By evening, she'd had 3 visitors, all claiming concern for propriety. The first was Reverend Hartwell, a thin man with watery eyes who suggested that perhaps Emmett should be moved to a proper home. "Whose home?" Caroline asked. "Name one family willing to take in an injured stranger for 6 weeks without compensation." The Reverend hemmed and hawed but couldn't provide an answer. The second visitor was Mrs. Wellington, president of the Ladies' Aid Society, who informed Caroline that her presence was causing distress among the good women of the town. Then perhaps they should find more worthwhile things to distress them, Caroline replied. "There are plenty of real problems in this world without inventing new ones." The third was Marshall Dixon, a gruff man with kind eyes who at least seemed genuinely concerned. "I've got no issue with charity," he said, hat in hand. "But folks are talking. Maybe it'd be better if we found somewhere else." "Where?" Caroline interrupted. "Where in this town would both Mr. Lyles and I be welcome, because I've looked, Marshall, and this shed is the only place that would have either of us." The marshal left without an answer, though he tipped his hat to her with something like respect. As night fell, Caroline made up her pallet in the opposite corner of the shed from Emmett. It was as much distance as the small space allowed, though she knew it wouldn't satisfy the gossips. "I'm sorry," Emmett said into the darkness. "This is my fault. If I hadn't been fool enough to let my horse shy. Accidents happen, and I made my choice to help you. I'll live with the consequences." "But your reputation was already ruined the moment I arrived alone. At least now I have a reason for staying." She heard him shift, probably trying to find a comfortable position with the broken leg. "You could leave, find another town, start fresh. Is that what you'd do? Abandon someone who needed you because strangers disapproved?" A long pause. "No, I suppose not." "Then we understand each other." Later, when his breathing had evened out into sleep, Caroline lay awake thinking. This was far from ideal, 2 strangers thrown together by circumstance, the subject of scandal and speculation. But it was also the first time in months she'd felt useful, needed. Tomorrow there would be more whispers, more disapproving looks, more suggestions that she leave town for the sake of decency. But tonight, she had a patient to care for and a purpose to fulfill. And sometimes, that was enough. The yellow dog scratched at the door, and she let it in. It circled 3 times before settling between her and Emmett, like a small, scruffy chaperone. "At least someone approves of the arrangement," she murmured. Outside, Dustwell settled into sleep, leaving Caroline to keep watch over her unexpected charge. Whatever tomorrow brought, she'd face it as she'd faced everything else, with stubborn determination and the knowledge that she was doing what was right, even if no one else could see it. The shed might be cold and drafty, Her reputation might be in tatters, and the future might be uncertain. But for now, she had work to do, and that was more than she'd had yesterday. It would have to be enough. The talk around Dustwell grew louder with each passing day. Caroline had become the town's favorite subject of speculation, her every movement watched and analyzed by those with nothing better to do. When she walked to the general store, curtains twitched. When she drew water from the well, conversations stopped. When she gathered herbs from the prairie, children were called inside. "The witch is coming," she heard little Tommy Morrison whisper to his sister one morning, before their mother yanked them away with a horrified look. Caroline kept her expression neutral, but the words stung. She'd been called many things in her travels: spinster, Jezebel, unnatural woman, but witch was new. Perhaps it was the herbs, or the way she'd set Emmett's leg with such practiced ease. In small towns, competence in a woman could be as damning as any scandal. Back at the shed, she found Emmett attempting to whittle a piece of wood with his pocket knife. His hands shook slightly. The laudanum she'd been carefully rationing was running low, and the pain was returning. "You should be resting," she said, setting down her gathered plants. "Can't rest every minute of the day. A man needs something to do with his hands." He looked up at her, noting the tightness around her eyes. "What happened?" "Nothing of consequence." Caroline. He'd taken to using her given name after the first week, and she hadn't corrected him. What did they say? She busied herself sorting the herbs: plantain for wounds, feverfew for headaches, wild chamomile for sleeplessness. "The Morrison children think I'm a witch. Their mother seems to agree." Emmett's jaw tightened. "Ignorant fools. They're just afraid. People always fear what they don't understand." "That doesn't make it right." She looked at him, surprised by the anger in his voice. He'd been unfailingly grateful and polite during his convalescence, but this was something different, genuine indignation on her behalf. "It doesn't matter," she said softly. "I've heard worse." "From who, when?" When she didn't answer, he set down his whittling. "Caroline, why do you let them treat you this way?" "Let them? What would you have me do? Demand respect at gunpoint, force them to accept me?" She shook her head. "I learned long ago that you can't make people see you differently than they want to. All you can do is continue being who you are and hope that someday someone notices." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I notice." The simple words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Caroline turned away, focusing on preparing a poultice for his leg. The swelling had gone down considerably, and the bone seemed to be knitting properly. Another few weeks and he'd be able to put weight on it. Another few weeks and he'd leave. The thought shouldn't have bothered her. She'd always known this was temporary. But somewhere between the daily care and quiet conversations, she'd grown accustomed to his presence, to having someone to talk to who didn't look at her with suspicion or disdain. That evening, Mrs. Wellington returned with reinforcements, 3 other members of the Ladies' Aid Society, all wearing identical expressions of righteous determination. "Miss Gentry." "Mrs." Wellington began, her voice pitched to Carrie. "We've come to make you a generous offer." Caroline didn't invite them in. Instead, stepping outside to meet them, she could feel Emmett watching from inside the shed, probably gripping his knife like he might need to defend her honor. "I'm listening." "The Ladies' Aid Society has collected funds to secure your passage to California. We'll provide you with coach fare and a letter of recommendation to a hospital in San Francisco that takes women of your experience." "Women of my experience," Caroline repeated flatly. "You mean fallen women?" "Mrs." Wellington's cheeks colored, but she pressed on. "You'd have a fresh start, proper employment, and the chance to live respectably. Surely that's better than—" She gestured at the shed with obvious distaste. "And Mr. Lyles. The society will ensure he's cared for until he can travel. One of our members has a spare room." Caroline almost laughed, now that they wanted her gone. Suddenly, they could find room for Emmett. That's very generous, but I must decline. Miss Gentry, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. I have a patient who needs consistent care. I won't abandon him to satisfy your sense of propriety. Your presence here is a corrupting influence. One of the other women burst out. Already, the younger girls are asking questions, wondering why you're allowed to live as you do. Then perhaps you should tell them the truth, that I'm a trained nurse caring for an injured man because no one else would, that I sleep in a shed because your respectable boarding house turned me away, that I'm condemned for doing work that would be praised if I were a man or married. Caroline's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. If that's corruption, then I'll wear the label proudly. Mrs. Wellington drew herself up. We're trying to help you. No, you're trying to remove an inconvenience. There's a difference. The women left in a huff, their bustles swaying with indignation. Caroline watched them go, then returned to the shed to find Emmett struggling to stand. What are you doing? She rushed to steady him. Those harpies had no right. He was breathing hard from the effort and pain. Sit down before you undo all my work. She helped him back to his makeshift bed. They're not worth injuring yourself over. They insulted you. They offered me coach fare to California. Some might call that generous. Why didn't you take it? His eyes searched hers. It would be easier for you. A new start, like they said. Caroline was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. The truth was complicated. Part stubbornness, part duty, and part something else she didn't want to examine too closely. I don't abandon my patients, she said finally. Besides, California has plenty of nurses. Dustwell, apparently, has only one witch woman who knows how to set bones. He caught her hand as she turned away. His palm was calloused from years of rope work, warm against her skin. You're no witch. You're the closest thing to a saint I've ever met. Saints don't end up sleeping in sheds with strange men. Maybe they do. Maybe that's exactly where they end up, in the broken places, with the people others have given up on. She gently pulled her hand free, disturbed by how much he wanted to leave it in his grasp. You're getting philosophical. Must be the laudanum. But that night, as she lay on her pallet listening to his steady breathing, she thought about what he'd said, about broken places and abandoned people, about saints and sinners and the thin line between them. Outside, she could hear the town settling into sleep, the same town that whispered about her by day and locked its doors against her at night, but here in this drafty shed, with an injured cowboy and a yellow dog for company. She'd found something unexpected, not quite home. That was too grand a word for it, but perhaps a place to rest, at least for a while. The next morning brought a surprise visitor, Dr. Marcus Thornton, the town's only physician. He was a portly man with graying whiskers and the broken blood vessels of a dedicated drinker. Heard you've been practicing medicine without a license, he said without preamble. Caroline met his gaze steadily. I've been providing basic nursing care, nothing that requires a license in the territories. He grunted and pushed past her into the shed, where Emmett watched warily. Let me see this leg you've supposedly set. Caroline bit back her protests as the doctor examined Emmett's leg with less gentleness than necessary. But when he was done, his expression had changed from skepticism to something like respect. Clean break, properly aligned, healing well. He looked at Caroline. Where did you train? I learned during the border conflicts, field medicine. He stood, brushing off his trousers. I could use an assistant, someone who knows their way around wounds and illness. The pay would be minimal, but it would be legitimate work. Caroline's heart leaped, but she kept her expression neutral. And my living arrangements would need to become more conventional. Can't have my assistant causing scandals. I see. And my current patient. The doctor glanced at Emmett. He seems to be healing well enough. A few more weeks and he'll be on his way. There it was. The respectable opportunity she'd been hoping for. Real work, legitimate income, a chance to practice her skills without condemnation. All she had to do was abandon Emmett to whoever would take him and pretend the last 2 weeks hadn't happened. "I appreciate the offer," she said slowly. "Can I have time to consider?" "Don't take too long. My current assistant is leaving at month's end." He tipped his hat and left, his medical bag swinging at his side. Emmett was quiet after the doctor left. When Caroline brought him his noon meal, he barely touched it. "You should take the job," he said finally. "Should I?" "It's what you've been looking for. Respectable work. A real position." "Yes." "Then why are you hesitating?" Caroline sat beside him, abandoning pretense. "I don't know. Maybe because respectability seems less important than I thought it would. Maybe because I've gotten used to our arrangement here. Or maybe—" She trailed off. "Maybe what?" "Maybe I'm tired of changing myself to fit what others expect. I've been doing it for years, trying to be proper enough, quiet enough, invisible enough to be accepted. And where has it gotten me? Still sleeping in sheds, still unwanted." She looked at him. "At least here, I'm unwanted on my own terms." Emmett shifted, wincing slightly. "For what it's worth, you're not unwanted, not by me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Outside, Caroline could hear children playing, their laughter carrying on the autumn wind. Life going on, as it always did, just beyond her reach. But here in this small, drafty space, she'd found something worth more than respectability. A person who saw her as she was, not as the town's gossip painted her. It might not last. In fact, she was certain it wouldn't, but for now, it was enough. "I should check your bandages," she said, retreating to safer ground. "Caroline," his voice stopped her. "Whatever you decide about the job or anything else, just know that these weeks haven't been a hardship. Not for me." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and busied herself with medical tasks that had become as familiar as breathing. The yellow dog watched from its corner, tail thumping occasionally against the floor, the only witness to whatever was growing between them in this place of broken things and stubborn hope. The evening came with a chill that spoke of winter approaching, and Caroline built the fire higher than usual. She'd managed to trade some of her medicinal herbs for firewood with the Hendricks family, who lived on the outskirts of town. They'd been kind enough, though she'd seen the wife cross herself after Caroline left. Emmett had been quiet all afternoon, lost in thought since Dr. Thornton's visit. Now, as shadows lengthened across the shed floor, he finally spoke. "Tell me about him." Caroline looked up from the torn shirt she was mending, one of his, blood-stained from the accident. "Who?" "The soldier, the one you couldn't save." Her hands stilled on the fabric. In 3 weeks of shared quarters, they'd talked about many things: his childhood on a ranch in Texas, her early days studying medical texts by candlelight, the weather, the ornery nature of cattle, the best way to brew willow bark tea, but they'd carefully avoided the deeper waters of their pasts. "Why do you want to know?" "Because you carry him with you. I see it in your eyes sometimes, when you think I'm sleeping. The way you check my breathing in the night, count my pulse like you're afraid it'll stop." He shifted, trying to find a comfortable position. "I'm not made of glass. Caroline, you can tell me." She set aside the mending and stared into the fire. "His name was Daniel Carpenter. He was 22 years old, from a farm in Ohio. He had a sweetheart named Sarah who sent him letters every week, pressed violets in the pages." The memory came flooding back, the medical tent, the smell of blood and infection, the endless rows of wounded men calling for water, for their mothers, for God. He took a musket ball to the shoulder. It should have been simple: extract the ball, clean the wound, let it heal. I'd done it dozens of times. Her voice was steady, but her hands clenched in her lap. But infection set in. In those conditions, with limited supplies, it happened sometimes. The wound went septic. Emmett waited, not pushing, just present. I knew we needed proper medicine, carbolic acid, clean bandages, something to fight the infection. The supply wagon was due any day, but Daniel didn't have days, so I made a choice. She drew a shaky breath. I left him in the care of another nurse and rode out to meet the supply train, to hurry them along. It took me 18 hours, 9 there, 9 back. The supplies were there, just as promised. Everything I needed to save him and a dozen others. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But Daniel died while I was gone. 2 hours before I returned. The other nurse said he asked for me at the end. Wanted to give me a message for Sarah. Caroline. I made the logical choice. The supplies I brought back saved other lives. But logic doesn't help when you're holding letters from a grieving woman who wants to know if her Daniel suffered, if he was afraid, if he knew he was loved. She finally looked at Emmett. I couldn't tell her I wasn't there, that I'd chosen the many over the one. You couldn't have known. No, I couldn't, but that's the burden of making choices about life and death. You have to live with them, right or wrong. She stood abruptly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. I need some air. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under a darkening sky. The first stars were appearing, and somewhere a coyote howled. Caroline breathed deeply, trying to shake off the weight of memory. She heard him before she saw him, the awkward thump and drag of someone moving on makeshift crutches. She turned to find Emmett laboriously making his way toward her, face set with determination. You shouldn't be up. Probably not. He made it to her side and leaned heavily on the crutches she'd fashioned from sturdy branches. But you shouldn't be alone with ghosts. I'm not an angel, Emmett. I'm just a woman who learned field medicine because I had steady hands and a strong stomach. I've lost more patients than I've saved. But you tried. That matters. Does it to Daniel, to Sarah. He was quiet for a moment. My mother died when I was 12. Pneumonia. The doctor was 3 towns away, dealing with a diphtheria outbreak. He could have come, but he chose to stay where he could help more people. Emmett shifted his weight, grimacing. I hated him for years. Thought if he'd just come, she might have lived. And now I understand he made the only choice he could. Doesn't mean it didn't hurt. Doesn't mean I don't still miss her. But I understand. He looked at her. Sarah will understand too. Someday. And I'll bet Daniel would rather you saved those dozen others than sat by his bed watching him die. Caroline felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since that terrible day. You don't know that. No, but I know what kind of man volunteers to fight for his country. And I know what kind of woman risks everything to help strangers. He swayed slightly, and she automatically moved to steady him. You're not an angel, Caroline. You're something better. You're human. You make impossible choices and live with the consequences and keep helping anyway. You're going to fall if you don't get back inside. Worth it, he muttered, but allowed her to help him back to the shed. Getting him settled again took some effort, and by the time he was lying down, sweat beaded his forehead from the exertion and pain. That was foolish, Caroline scolded, checking his splints. Maybe, but you needed to hear it. He caught her hand. You're not responsible for saving everyone. Caroline, you're just responsible for trying. She looked down at their joined hands, his rough and sun-darkened, hers pale with herb stains under the nails. I don't know how to do anything else. Then just don't carry the weight of the ones you couldn't save. They wouldn't want that. Later that night, after the fire had burned low and Emmett's breathing had deepened into sleep, Caroline pulled out the small packet of letters she kept in her medical bag. Letters from Sarah that she'd never answered, never returned. She'd carried them for 3 years, unopened reminders of her failure. By the light of a single candle, she finally opened the first one. Dear Miss Gentry, It read in careful script. I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to thank you for caring for my Daniel in his final days. The chaplain told me how you fought to save him, how you never gave up hope. The letter went on, full of gratitude Caroline felt she didn't deserve. Sarah wrote of her grief, yes, but also of her comfort in knowing Daniel hadn't been alone, that someone had cared enough to fight for him. Caroline read all 6 letters, tears flowing freely now. In trying to protect herself from Sarah's imagined condemnation, she'd denied them both the connection that might have helped them heal. Tomorrow, she would write back. She would tell Sarah about Daniel's courage, his humor even in pain, the way he'd shared his water ration with younger soldiers. She would give Sarah the truth she deserved, even if it came 3 years late. The yellow dog whined softly and padded over to lean against her leg. She scratched its ears absently, thinking about angels and humans, about perfect choices and imperfect ones, about the grace found in simply trying. Across the shed, Emmett stirred but didn't wake. His presence had become a comfort she hadn't expected, a reminder that she wasn't alone in her imperfections. He'd seen her at her worst tonight, bitter, guilty, haunted by the past, and hadn't turned away. Not an angel, she whispered to the sleeping form. Thank God for that. Angels, after all, didn't need forgiveness. They didn't need understanding or acceptance or the warmth of another person's hand in theirs. They didn't need someone to remind them that being human, with all its failures and small triumphs, was enough. But she did. And perhaps in this unlikely place with this unlikely companion, she was beginning to find it. The candle guttered and went out, leaving only the faint glow of embers in the hearth. Caroline settled onto her pallet, feeling lighter than she had in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Doctor. Thornton would want his answer. The townspeople would continue their whispers, and Emmett would be one day closer to leaving. But tonight, she had unburdened herself of a ghost and found, instead of judgment, understanding. It was more than she'd dared hope for, and exactly what she'd needed. The yellow dog circled 3 times and settled between them, and Caroline smiled in the darkness. Not an angel, not a saint, not a witch, just a woman trying her best in a world that rarely made it easy. For tonight, that was enough. A week passed before the confrontation came. Caroline had turned down Dr. Thornton's offer, choosing instead to continue her arrangement with Emmett. The doctor had left with a shake of his head and a muttered comment about foolish women. But Caroline felt no regret. Some things were worth more than respectability. The morning started like any other. Caroline was returning from the well with water when she noticed the crowd gathered near the church. Reverend Hartwell stood on the steps, holding what appeared to be an official document. Beside him stood Thomas Brennan, the town's most prosperous rancher, and a man who believed his wealth gave him authority over everyone else's moral conduct. "Miss Gentry," Brennan called out as she approached. "Good. We need to discuss your situation." Caroline set down the water buckets carefully. She'd known this was coming. The whispers had grown louder, the looks more hostile. "My situation is my own concern, Mr. Brennan. Not when it affects the moral fabric of our community." He held up the paper. "This is a petition, signed by 37 upstanding citizens, requesting that you vacate that shed and leave Dustwell immediately." "On what grounds?" "Improper conduct, corrupting influence, practicing medicine without proper credentials." "I'm a nurse, not a doctor. I've claimed nothing more." "You're an unmarried woman living with a man who isn't your husband." "Mrs." Wellington chimed in from the crowd. "It's indecent." Caroline felt her temper flare, but kept her voice steady. "I'm caring for an injured man because no one else would. If that offends you, perhaps you should examine why Christian charity is less important to you than appearances." Brennan's face reddened. "Don't you dare lecture us on Christian values, woman. You're nothing but a—" "Careful." Emmett's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. He stood in the doorway of the shed, balanced on his crutches. his expression dangerous. "Finish that sentence, and you'll answer to me." "Mr. Lyles," Reverend Hartwell said nervously, "we're simply trying to maintain order." "Order?" Emmett hobbled forward, each step deliberate despite the obvious pain. "Is that what you call running off a woman who's done nothing but help people? She saved my life. She's treated half your children for fevers and cuts, never asking for payment. And this is how you repay her." "She's refused proper arrangements," Brennan said stiffly. "Doctor, Thornton offered her legitimate employment, with conditions that would have left me without care." Emmett had reached Caroline's side now, close enough that she could see the strain around his eyes. "Tell me, Brennan, if your wife was sick, would you want her tended by someone who abandoned their previous patient for a better offer?" "That's different." "Why? Because your wife is respectable, because she has a husband to defend her." Emmett's voice was rising now. "Caroline Gentry has more honor in her little finger than this whole crowd combined. She could have left me to die. She could have taken your bribes to leave town. She could have bent to your narrow-minded demands. Instead, she stayed and helped, knowing exactly what it would cost her." Pretty words from a man sharing her bed. Someone called from the crowd. The silence that followed was electric. Caroline saw Emmett's free hand clench into a fist, saw Brennan step forward with anticipation. Violence hung in the air like smoke before a prairie fire. "Stop!" Caroline stepped between them, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is what you want, isn't it? Drama? Scandal? Something to justify your prejudices? Well, I won't give it to you. Won't give." She turned to face the crowd, meeting as many eyes as would hold her gaze. "Yes, I share a shelter with Mr. Lyles. We sleep on opposite sides of a drafty shed with a dog between us. I tend his injuries and cook our meals and wash our clothes because that's what needs doing. If you see impropriety in that, the failing is in your minds, not our actions." "Nevertheless," Brennan began. But Caroline wasn't finished. "I've asked for nothing from this town except the right to exist. I've helped when I could, stayed quiet when you whispered about me, accepted your inflated prices and cold shoulders without complaint. But I will not be run off like a criminal for the crime of compassion. The petition is worthless." Marshal Dixon pushed through the crowd, his weathered face set in hard lines. "I've been watching this situation, and I see no laws being broken. Miss Gentry has as much right to stay as anyone else." "Marshal, surely you can't approve." "What I approve or don't approve isn't the law. Brennan, and last I checked, you weren't elected judge of this town." The marshal turned to Caroline. "Ma'am, you're free to stay as long as you like. Anyone tries to force you out, they'll answer to me." The crowd began to disperse, muttering and shooting dark looks. Brennan crumpled the petition in his fist, his face twisted with fury. "This isn't over," he said quietly, then stalked away. "Mrs." Wellington lingered, her expression troubled. "Miss Gentry, perhaps we've been hasty. If you would consider more appropriate arrangements." "My arrangements suit me fine," Caroline said firmly. "Good day, Mrs. Wellington." When they were alone again, Emmett sagged against his crutches. Caroline quickly moved to support him, guiding him back to the shed. "That was foolish," she scolded as she helped him settle back onto his bed. "You could have undone weeks of healing." "Worth it." He caught her hand as she fussed with his blankets. "I meant every word." Caroline looked down at him. This man who had stood up for her when no one else would, who had risked his own recovery to defend her honor. "I know you did. Thank you." "Don't thank me for speaking the truth." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "Caroline, I need to say something." "Don't." She pulled her hand free gently. "Please don't." "Why not?" "Because in a few weeks, your leg will be healed. You'll ride out to rejoin your outfit or find work on another ranch. And I'll still be here, or somewhere like here, doing what I do." She turned away. Words spoken in gratitude have a way of fading with distance. You think this is gratitude. What else could it be? You're a good man. Emmett. You'll go back to your life and find a proper woman who doesn't come with a scandal attached. Someone who can give you a home and children and respectability. I don't want... Yes, you do. Or you will, once you're away from here. She busied herself preparing the noon meal, needing the familiar activity. That's how it should be. They ate in strained silence, the easy companionship of recent days replaced by awareness of all the things they couldn't say. As Caroline cleaned up, she noticed Emmett watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "About gratitude, about what I want, about all of it. But I won't push. You've had enough people trying to force their will on you." That evening, as the sun set over the prairie, they sat outside the shed as had become their habit. The yellow dog lay between them, panting contentedly. The confrontation with the townspeople had shifted something, made their temporary arrangement feel more fragile. "Storm coming," Emmett observed, nodding toward the dark clouds building on the horizon. "First snow. Maybe winter comes early here." "What will you do? The shed won't hold heat once the real cold sets in." Caroline shrugged. "I'll manage. I always do." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." She pulled her shawl tighter. "Don't worry about me. Emmett, worry about getting your strength back." He made a frustrated sound. "You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met." Probably true. They watched the storm approach in silence, each lost in thoughts they couldn't share. When the first fat raindrops began to fall, they retreated inside. Caroline lit the lantern and settled with her mending while Emmett worked on the piece of wood he'd been carving. "What is that?" she asked, curious despite herself. He held it up, a rough but recognizable figure of a woman in a long dress, head held high. "It's you, or trying to be. I'm no artist." Caroline took the small carving, touched by the gesture, in wood. He'd captured something she didn't see in herself. Strength, dignity, defiance. "It's beautiful. Keep it. Something to remember. This time." She closed her fingers around the carving, feeling the weight of all the words they weren't saying. Outside, the storm broke in earnest, rain hammering on the roof and wind howling through the gaps in the walls. "Caroline," his voice was soft in the lamplight. "Whatever happens, however this ends, I want you to know that these weeks haven't been about gratitude. Not for me." She looked at him across the small space, this good man who had complicated her already complicated life. "I know," she whispered. "That's what makes it harder." The storm raged on, but inside the shed, there was only the quiet understanding of two people who had found something precious in the most unlikely place and didn't quite know what to do with it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Brennan wouldn't give up easily, and winter was coming with all its hardships. But tonight, with rain drumming on the roof and a carved wooden figure warm in her hand, Caroline allowed herself to feel something she'd thought lost forever, the bittersweet ache of possibility, even if it was destined to remain just that. The change began slowly, like spring coming to the prairie. First, it was Mrs. Garrett, the baker's wife, appearing at the shed door with her youngest son, who had a deep cut on his palm from playing too roughly with a pocket knife. "I heard you know about wounds," she said stiffly, not quite meeting Caroline's eyes. "Doctor, Thornton is away, and the boy won't stop bleeding." Caroline cleaned and stitched the wound with practiced efficiency while the child watched with wide eyes, more fascinated than frightened. When she finished, "Mrs." Garrett fumbled for her purse. "I don't take payment," Caroline said. "Then take this." The woman thrust a wrapped loaf of fresh bread at her. "It's only fair." After that, they came in a trickle. A mother with a colicky baby, an old man with joints that ached in the cold, a young woman who whispered her troubles while Caroline brewed herbs that might help with monthly pains. They came at odd hours, when their neighbors wouldn't see, bringing what payment they could: a dozen eggs, a sack of potatoes, a warm quilt that appeared on the shed doorstep with no note. Caroline converted a corner of the shed into a makeshift clinic, using old crates as shelves for her growing collection of medicines and supplies. Emmett helped when he could, fashioning a proper examination table from salvaged lumber and building shelves that actually stayed level. "You're becoming the town doctor, whether they admit it or not," he observed one evening, watching her organize her latest acquisitions: proper bandages from the general store, paid for with actual money from grateful patients. "A doctor. Thornton won't appreciate the competition." Thornton's a drunk who charges too much and judges too harshly. People know the difference between healing and just going through the motions. Caroline smiled at that, remembering how just weeks ago, these same people had wanted her gone. Fear and pain had a way of clarifying what truly mattered. The real test came on a bitter November night when pounding on the door woke them both. Caroline opened it to find Thomas Brennan himself, the man who'd led the charge to exile her, holding a small figure wrapped in blankets. "It's my daughter," he said, his earlier arrogance replaced by naked fear. "She can't breathe. Thornton's drunk. Won't answer his door. Please." Caroline didn't hesitate. "Bring her in." The child, little Margaret, perhaps 6 years old, was burning with fever, her breath coming in short, wheezing gasps. Caroline recognized the symptoms immediately: croup, severe but treatable if caught in time. "Emmett, stoke the fire and boil water. We need steam." She turned to Brennan. "Hold her upright. Help her breathe." She worked through the night, creating a tent of blankets to trap steam, dosing the child with willow bark tea, applying hot compresses to her chest. Brennan sat silent, all his pompous authority stripped away until he was just another frightened father. By dawn, Margaret's breathing had eased. The fever broke as the sun painted the eastern sky pink and gold. The child slept peacefully, her small hand clutching her father's finger. "She'll be fine," Caroline said, exhausted but satisfied. "Keep her warm, plenty of fluids. I'll check on her later." Brennan looked at her with reddened eyes. Thank you. I was wrong about you, about all of it. You were afraid. Fear makes fools of us all sometimes." He reached for his wallet, but Caroline shook her head. "Your daughter's health is payment enough." "No." His voice was firm. "You saved her life, and I nearly drove you from town out of petty righteousness." He pulled out several bills. "This is for the clinic, to make it proper. Walls, a real roof, whatever you need." Caroline stared at the money, more than she'd seen in years. "Mr. Brennan." "Thomas and I won't take no for an answer. Consider it penance." After he left, carrying his sleeping daughter, Caroline sank onto a crate, overwhelmed. Emmett hobbled over and sat beside her. "You did it," he said quietly. "You won them over." "I did my job." "You did more than that. You showed them who you really are." He covered her hand with his. "I'm proud of you." She looked at him, this man who had believed in her when no one else would. His leg was nearly healed now. He could put weight on it, walk without crutches for short distances. Soon, there would be no medical reason for him to stay. The thought made her chest tight. Word of Margaret Brennan's recovery spread quickly. Within days, Caroline found herself with more patients than she could handle in the shed. True to his word, Thomas Brennan organized work parties to convert the abandoned stable behind the general store into a proper clinic. Men who had shunned her now showed up with hammers and saws, building examination rooms and waiting areas. "Guilt's a powerful motivator," Marshall Dixon observed, stopping by to check the progress. "That and knowing they might need you themselves someday." Caroline was checking on the construction one afternoon when she noticed a familiar figure among the workers. Emmett was helping to frame a doorway, his movements careful but determined. You shouldn't be doing heavy labor yet. She called—" He grinned down at her from his perch on a ladder. "I'm fine. Besides, I want to see this finished proper before—" He stopped abruptly. "Before you leave." She finished the sentence. He couldn't. "Caroline. The foreman from the Box T Ranch was in town yesterday. He mentioned they're hiring for the winter." She kept her voice steady. "Clinical. Your legs should be strong enough for ranch work by month's end." He climbed down from the ladder, favoring his injured legs slightly. "You trying to get rid of me?" "I'm trying to be practical. You're a cowboy, Emmett. You need work, wages, a future. I can't offer any of that. Maybe I don't want what you think I need." Before she could respond, young Tommy Morrison came running up. Miss Caroline, Mama says to come quick. The baby's coming early." Caroline grabbed her medical bag and hurried after the boy, grateful for the interruption. She couldn't afford to hear whatever Emmett had been about to say. Hope was a luxury she'd given up long ago. The birth was difficult but successful, a healthy girl born just as the sun set. Caroline emerged from the Morrison house exhausted but exhilarated, to find Emmett waiting with the wagon. "Thought you might need a ride back," he said, helping her up. They rode in comfortable silence through the darkening streets. The town that had once seemed so hostile now felt almost welcoming, with lit windows and the smell of cooking dinners, the sound of families settling in for the night. "I've been thinking," Emmett said as they reached the shed. "The clinic will need someone to help maintain it, fix things when they break, keep the fires going in winter, deal with difficult patients." "I suppose so. Seems like that would be steady work, the kind that might keep a man in one place." Caroline's heart began to race, but she kept her voice neutral. "It wouldn't pay much." "Don't need much, just enough to get by." "Emmett, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he said quickly. "But I'm not ready to ride away either. Not from you, not from this." He gestured at the town, the half-built clinic, the life she was creating. "Unless you truly want me gone." Caroline stood there in the gathering darkness, torn between practicality and desire, between protecting her heart and taking a chance. The yellow dog appeared from somewhere, tail wagging, and wound between their legs like it was trying to tie them together. "Stay," she said finally, the word barely above a whisper. "For the work, for the clinic, stay." His smile was bright enough to light the darkness. "For the work, of course." That night, as they settled into their familiar routine, she with her mending, he with his carving, something had shifted between them. Not a declaration, not a promise, but a possibility. A future that might include both of them, built as carefully and deliberately as the clinic rising from the abandoned stable. "Caroline," Emmett's voice was thoughtful. "That first night, when you found me on the prairie, were you really just gathering wood?" She looked up from her sewing. "No, I was running away, thinking about moving on to another town, somewhere that might be different." "What stopped you?" "You did, broken leg and all." She smiled softly. "Seems I'm not very good at walking away from people who need help." "Lucky for me." "Yes," she agreed, thinking of all that had changed since that morning on the prairie. "Lucky for both of us." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing Dustwell in white. But inside the shed, warmed by the fire and the quiet companionship of two people who had found each other against all odds, Caroline felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt home. The clinic had been open for 2 weeks, and Caroline had never been busier. What had started as a makeshift corner in a shed had become a proper medical facility, with 2 examination rooms, a waiting area, and quarters in the back where she could rest between patients. Emmett had taken charge of maintaining the building, fixing everything from squeaky hinges to drafty windows, making himself indispensable in ways that had nothing to do with his healing leg. It was late December now, and snow lay thick on the ground. Caroline had just finished treating the Hendricks' youngest for a persistent cough when she heard the bell above the door chime. She looked up to see Emmett standing in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his expression unreadable. "Long day?" he asked, though he knew the answer. He'd been there for most of it, helping her reorganize supplies, keeping the fires burning, calming nervous patients with his steady presence. "The longest yet, but good, Mrs. Patterson's fever finally broke, and the Johnson baby is nursing properly now." She dried her hands on her apron, suddenly aware of how tired she was. "You should head back to the boarding house. Mrs. Murphy will have supper waiting." Emmett had taken a room at the boarding house once the clinic opened. Propriety demanded it, and even Caroline had agreed it was necessary, but he spent most of his waking hours at the clinic anyway, finding endless tasks that required his attention. "Actually," he said, closing the door behind him and turning the sign to "Closed," "I wanted to talk to you about something." Caroline felt her stomach tighten. This was it, then, the conversation she'd been dreading. He'd stayed long enough to see her settled, the clinic established. Now he would tell her about the ranch job he'd accepted, the crew he'd be joining come spring. "There's coffee on the stove," she said, needing to busy her hands. "We can talk in the back room." The quarters behind the clinic were simple but comfortable. A small stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed that she'd been using when overnight cases required her constant attention. Emmett had built shelves along one wall for her medical texts and personal items. It was more of a home than she'd had in years. She poured coffee with hands that weren't quite steady, aware of him watching her. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the town settling in for the night. "Caroline," he began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd come to recognize as nervousness. "This isn't easy for me to say." "Then just say it." She sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her cup for warmth. "I've been expecting it." "You have?" "Of course. Your leg is healed. You've stayed longer than necessary already. I'm grateful for all your help. Truly. But I understand." "No," he interrupted. "You don't understand at all." He leaned forward, his honey-colored eyes intense. "Caroline, I need to tell you something about that night, the one when little Margaret Brennan was so sick." She blinked at the unexpected turn. "What about it?" "You worked straight through until dawn. You never stopped, never rested, never gave up even when it looked hopeless. And when she finally started breathing easier, when we knew she'd make it, you had this look on your face." He paused, searching for words. "It was like watching the sun come up. Pure joy, pure relief, pure purpose." "It's what I do." "Let me finish, please." He took a deep breath. "That night, watching you work, seeing how you fought for that child like she was your own, that's when I knew." "Knew what?" "That I couldn't leave. Not ever." He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. "Caroline, I've been trying to find the right words for weeks now, but standing in that doorway tonight, seeing you here in this place you've built, doing the work you were meant to do, there aren't any pretty words that would be enough." Caroline's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Emmett." "So I'll just say it plain. Let me stay with you tonight. Let me hold you, just this once. Not because I'm leaving, but because I can't stand another night of pretending that being near you isn't all I think about." The words hung between them like a physical presence. Caroline stared at him, this man who had stayed when everyone else had judged her, who had defended her when she'd had no other champion, who had quietly made himself essential to her life in ways she was only now beginning to understand. "Just this once," she echoed softly. His jaw tightened. "If that's all you can give, I'll take it. I'd rather have one night of honesty than a lifetime of pretending we're just whatever this is we've been pretending to be. And tomorrow..." Tomorrow I'll go back to fixing hinges and stoking fires and pretending my heart doesn't stop every time you smile, if that's what you need." Caroline stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, Dustwell slept under its blanket of snow, peaceful and quiet. In the reflection, she could see Emmett watching her, waiting. "I'm not good at this," she said finally. "I've spent so long alone, so long being practical and careful, and—" She turned to face him. "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of wanting something I can't have, of believing in something that might not last, of waking up one morning to find you've realized you could do better than a woman with more past than future." Emmett rose and crossed to her, still not touching, just standing close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Caroline Ruth Gentry," he said quietly, "you are the strongest, most stubborn, most magnificent woman I have ever known. You've taken everything this hard world could throw at you and turned it into purpose. You've made a place for yourself here through sheer will and determination. And somewhere along the way, you made a place for me too." "Emmett, I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking for forever. I'm just asking for tonight, for the truth of what's between us. Just this once." Caroline looked up at him. This good man who had complicated her carefully ordered life, who had shown her that solitude wasn't the same as strength, that accepting help wasn't the same as weakness. She thought of all the reasons to say no, all the careful boundaries she'd built to protect herself. Then she thought of Margaret Brennan breathing easily, of the clinic full of people who trusted her, of the way Emmett's eyes lit up when he laughed, of the wooden carving she kept on her bedside shelf, a woman standing tall and unafraid. "Not just this once," she whispered, making her choice. "Not if you're staying." His eyes widened with hope. "Caroline!" She reached up, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his face. "If we do this, it changes everything. You understand that the town will talk, your reputation." "Hang my reputation. Hang the town." He covered her hand with his. "All I care about is you." "I'm not an easy woman to love." Emmett Lyles. "Good thing I'm a patient man. Then—" He smiled, that crooked grin that had become so dear to her. "I've got nowhere else to be." She rose on her tiptoes and kissed him then, pouring weeks of uncertainty and longing into that simple touch. He responded with a gentleness that made her heart ache, as if she were something precious and fragile instead of the practical, work-worn woman she knew herself to be. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" "No," she admitted. "But I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of being alone. And I'm tired of pretending that you haven't already carved out a place in my heart, whether I wanted you to or not." He laughed softly. "Only you would make that sound like a complaint." "It is a complaint. I had everything ordered just so, and then you had to come along with your broken leg and your kind eyes and your steady presence. And now I can't imagine doing this without you." "Then don't imagine it. I mean, because I'm not going anywhere." Later, as they lay together on the narrow bed, the snow still falling outside and the yellow dog curled up by the stove, it had somehow found its way into the clinic and refused to leave. Caroline traced patterns on Emmett's chest and marveled at the turn her life had taken. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice drowsy and content. "That 6 weeks ago, I was sleeping in a shed, unwanted and alone. Now I have a clinic, patients who trust me, and—" She paused, still not quite believing it. "And," he prompted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And you," she finished softly. "Somehow, I have you." "You've had me since the day you found me on that prairie," he said. "Just took us both a while to figure it out." She smiled against his shoulder. "We'll have to be careful, discreet. I can't afford to lose the clinic now that—" "Caroline," he interrupted gently. "We'll figure it out, together. But tonight, can we just be us? Not the scandal or the gossip or the expectations." Just Emmett and Caroline. Two people who found each other against all odds. Yes, she agreed, settling more firmly into his embrace. Just us. Outside, Dustwell slept on, unaware that in a small room behind the new clinic, two damaged souls had found healing in each other. Come morning, there would be challenges to face, gossip to weather, a future to navigate. But for tonight, in the warmth of each other's arms, they had everything they needed. Just this once had become just the beginning, and neither of them would have it any other way. The letter arrived on a February morning when the wind cut through Dustwell like a knife. Caroline was preparing medications when Mrs. Murphy bustled in, her face flushed with importance. "This came on the morning stage," she said, holding out an expensive-looking envelope. "From somewhere called Preston Holdings in Denver." Caroline's hand stilled. She recognized the letterhead. Preston Holdings owned several hospitals and medical facilities throughout the territories. With careful fingers, she broke the seal and read, "Dear Miss Gentry, your reputation as a skilled practitioner has reached our offices. We are pleased to offer you the position of head nurse at our new facility in Denver, with a salary of $50 monthly, full room and board, and the opportunity to work with the latest medical equipment. This position would put you under the supervision of Dr. Martin Ashford, renowned surgeon, where your skills would be properly utilized and recognized." "Well, Mrs. Murphy asked, barely containing her curiosity. "What is it?" "A job offer in Denver." Caroline folded the letter carefully. "If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Murphy, I have patients to tend to." But her mind was far from settled as she went through her morning rounds. $50 a month was more than she'd ever dreamed of earning. Denver meant civilization, proper medical facilities, respect for her profession. It was everything she'd thought she wanted. She was still distracted when Emmett arrived at noon, bringing lunch as had become his custom. He took one look at her face and set down the basket. "What's wrong?" Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. She watched his face as he read, saw the moment when understanding dawned, followed quickly by something that looked like fear. "It's a good offer," he said carefully, handing the letter back. "Yes." "The kind of opportunity you've worked for." "Yes." "You should take it." The words hit her like a physical blow. "That's what you think that I should go." "That's what you're thinking, isn't it?" His voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Denver? A real hospital? Everything proper and respectable." "Don't." "Don't what? Point out the obvious. You'd be a fool to turn this down for..." He gestured around the small clinic. "For this. For me." "I never said it was about you." "You didn't have to." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Caroline, I've got nothing to offer that can compete with this. I'm a broken-down cowboy who fixes hinges and builds shelves. They're offering you a future." "You are my future," she said quietly. He turned, hope and disbelief warring on his face. "What?" "Did you really think I'd leave after everything we've built here?" She moved to him, taking his hands in hers. "Emmett, I spent years chasing respectability, thinking if I could just find the right position, the right town, the right circumstances, I'd finally belong somewhere. But I was looking for the wrong things." "Caroline, let me finish. That morning I found you on the prairie. I was running away again, looking for something I couldn't even name. And then there you were, broken and needing help. And suddenly I had a purpose. Not just the healing. I'd done that before. But you saw me, not the scandal or the gossip or what I should be, but who I actually was. You're going to turn down the offer." It wasn't a question. "I already have. Wrote my response this morning." She smiled at his stunned expression. "Did you really think I'd choose Denver's fancy hospital over Dustwell's drafty clinic, over the life we're building, over you?" He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough that she could feel his heart racing. "You terrified me." He admitted against her hair. When I saw that letter, all I could think was that I was about to lose you. Never, she promised. You're stuck with me, Emmett Lyles, broken hinges and all. They might have stayed like that indefinitely. But the bell above the door chimed. They stepped apart to find young Samuel Patterson standing in the doorway, grinning from ear to ear. Pa sent me to fetch you. Miss Caroline. Ma's having the baby. Caroline grabbed her medical bag. The Denver offer already forgotten. Tell your father I'm on my way. Emmett, I need hot water and clean linens. Already on it, he said, moving with practiced efficiency. As she headed for the door, Samuel piped up. Pa also said to tell you that Mr. Garrett from the bank wants to see you when you have time. Something about the town council and a proposal. Caroline paused. The town council? That's what he said. Ma'am, said it was important, but not urgent. The Patterson birth was straightforward, and by evening Caroline was back at the clinic. Tired but satisfied. She found Emmett waiting with dinner and news. Garrett came by while you were out, he said. Left this. Another official-looking envelope? Caroline opened it with some trepidation, then read aloud. The Dustwell Town Council hereby proposes to recognize the clinic as an official town institution, with an annual stipend of $200 for supplies and maintenance. Furthermore, we propose to officially appoint Miss Caroline Gentry as town nurse, with all the rights and respects accorded to that position. She looked up at Emmett, astonished. They want to make it official. The clinic, my position, everything. Seems the town finally figured out what I've known all along. They're lucky to have you. He grinned. Though I noticed they didn't mention anything about the handyman position. Might have to negotiate my own contract. Caroline laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. From pariah to town nurse in 6 months? Who would have believed it? I would have. He pulled her close. But then, I've always been smarter than I look. Modest, too. Among my many qualities. He grew serious. Caroline, about the Denver offer. Is already forgotten. My place is here. Emmett, our place is here. She gestured around the clinic. This is what I was meant to do. Where I was meant to be. It took me long enough to figure it out. But now that I have, I'm not letting go. That night, they sat in the small back room, planning improvements to the clinic that the town stipend would allow. The yellow dog lay at their feet, occasionally thumping its tail when their voices grew animated. Outside, a late winter storm was building, but inside was warm and bright. I've been thinking, Emmett said suddenly, about something more permanent than the boarding house. Caroline looked up from her lists. Oh, there's a piece of land just outside town. Good spot for a small house. Nothing fancy, but solid. Room for a garden, maybe some chickens. He wasn't quite meeting her eyes. Been thinking about buying it. That sounds permanent. That's the idea. Now he did look at her, his gaze steady and sure. I know we can't make things official yet. The town's come a long way, but not that far. But I want to build something that's ours, even if we have to be careful about appearances for a while. Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. You want to build a house? I want to build a home with you. He took her hand. What do you say? Caroline? Think you could stand having me underfoot permanent-like? She thought about the letter from Denver, about all the proper, respectable offers she might receive in the future. Then she thought about this man who had stayed when he could have left, who saw her strength instead of her scandal, who was offering her not just a house, but a home. I say yes, she said simply. To the house, to the home, to you being underfoot, to all of it. His smile was brighter than the lamplight. Even to the chickens. Even to the chickens, she laughed, though the dog might have opinions about that. As if in response, the yellow dog raised its head and woofed once, then settled back down with a contented sigh. Later, as the storm howled outside and the fire burned low, Caroline allowed herself to imagine it a small house on the edge of town, with a garden and chickens and maybe, someday, when the town had grown even more accepting, children playing in the yard. It wasn't the life she'd planned, wasn't the respectable position she'd once dreamed of. It was better, it was real and imperfect, and there's no regrets, Emmett asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. None, she said, and meant it. Not a single one. The clinic was quiet around them, waiting for tomorrow's patients, tomorrow's challenges. But for tonight, they had each other and the promise of a future they would build together, one careful day at a time. The woman who had ridden into Dustwell alone and unwanted had found her place at last, not in a fancy Denver hospital, but in a small frontier town that had learned to see past its prejudices. And the broken-down cowboy who'd thought his life was over when his legs shattered had found a new purpose and a love worth staying for. Sometimes the best endings were really just beginnings in disguise. The first snow of winter came early that year, blanketing Dustwell in pristine white that made even the roughest buildings look clean and new. Caroline stood in the doorway of the clinic, now properly established with a painted sign that read, Dustwell Medical Clinic, C. Gentry, Nurse Practitioner. 6 months had passed since she'd turned down the Denver position, and not a day went by that she regretted her choice. Miss Ruth, Miss Ruth. Little Emma Brennan came running through the snow, her breath making clouds in the cold air. She was clutching a cloth doll to her chest, its arm hanging by a thread. Caroline smiled. The child had taken to calling her Miss Ruth ever since she'd learned Caroline's middle name, and somehow it had stuck with all the town's children. What's wrong? Emma. Baby Caroline is hurt. The girl held up the doll with tears in her eyes. Her arm came off. Well, we can't have that. Caroline knelt in the snow, examining the doll with the same seriousness she'd give any patient. Bring her inside. I think we can fix this. As she stitched the doll's arm back in place, Emma chattered about how she'd named it after Caroline. Because she helps people feel better, just like you. It was moments like these that reminded Caroline how far she'd come from that cold night in the church shed. There, she said, tying off the thread. Good as new, but baby Caroline needs to rest now, so no rough play for a day or two. Emma nodded solemnly, then threw her arms around Caroline's neck. Thank you. Miss Ruth, Papa says you're the best thing that happened to this town. After the child left, Caroline found herself thinking about Thomas Brennan's transformation. The man who'd once led the charge to drive her out was now one of her staunchest supporters. Redemption, she'd learned, came in many forms. The bell above the door chimed, and Emmett entered, stamping snow from his boots. He'd been out at their property. She still marveled at the thought, working on the house they were building together. How's the construction coming? She asked, helping him out of his heavy coat. Roof's on tight. Windows are in. Should be ready by spring. He caught her hands, warming them between his own. Doc Thornton stopped by. Caroline raised an eyebrow. The old doctor had sobered up considerably since she'd arrived, perhaps motivated by competition or perhaps by shame. Either way, they'd developed a working relationship that benefited everyone. He wanted to know if you'd help with the Morrison baby surgery next week. Says he could use steady hands. Of course I'll help. She squeezed his hands. See, even Doc Thornton's coming around. The whole town's come around. You've worked miracles here. Caroline. We've worked miracles, she corrected. I couldn't have done any of this without you. He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. These quiet moments were precious, stolen between patients and responsibilities. Soon enough, they'd be interrupted by someone needing care. But for now, they had this. I love you, he said quietly. The words still new enough to send warmth spreading through her chest. And I love you, she replied, marveling at how easily the words came now. For so long, She'd believed love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Emmett had proven her wrong about that, just as he'd proven her wrong about so many things. The afternoon brought a familiar face, Marshall Dixon, looking worn and worried. "My wife," he said without preamble. "She's been poorly for weeks now. Weak, tired all the time. Doc Thornton can't figure it out." Caroline grabbed her bag. "Let me see her." At the Dixon house, she found Mary Dixon pale and listless, her breathing shallow. Caroline examined her carefully, noting the subtle signs others might miss. "When did you last have proper meat?" she asked gently. Mary looked confused. Times have been tight. I make sure Henry eats well, but—" Caroline nodded, understanding. She'd seen this before, women sacrificing their own nutrition for their families. "Mrs. Dixon, you're suffering from poor blood. You need iron-rich foods, rest, and this tonic." She pulled a bottle from her bag. "Take it 3 times daily with meals." "But the cost is already taken care of," Caroline said firmly. The town stipend allowed her to help those who couldn't pay, one of her requirements for accepting the position. Within 2 weeks, Mary Dixon was back to her old self, and the marshal's gratitude was evident in the way he tipped his hat extra deep whenever he passed Caroline on the street. Winter deepened, bringing with it the usual ailments: coughs, fevers, injuries from ice. Caroline worked tirelessly, with Emmett always there to help. He'd become as essential to the clinic's operation as she was, though his official title remained simply handyman. One evening, as they sat by the stove in the clinic's back room, Emmett pulled out a small wooden box. "Early Christmas present," he said, suddenly shy. Inside, Caroline found a simple silver ring set with a small turquoise stone. "Emmett, I know we can't make it official yet. The town's accepting, but not that accepting. But I wanted you to have something. A promise." He took the ring, sliding it onto her right hand. "Someday, when things are different, I'll put a proper wedding band on your left hand. But for now..." "For now, this is perfect." She kissed him, then laughed against his lips. "Do you remember what you said that night? Let me sleep in your arms tonight, just this once." "Best lie I ever told," he grinned, "because once was never going to be enough." "No," she agreed, "not nearly enough." The weeks passed in a comfortable rhythm. Their house grew under Emmett's skilled hands. The clinic thrived under Caroline's care, and the town that had once rejected her now embraced her as one of their own. She delivered babies, set bones, treated fevers, and slowly, steadily, earned her place in Dustwell's heart. Spring arrived with wildflowers and the completion of their house. It wasn't large, just 3 rooms and a porch, but it was theirs. The night they first slept there, on a bed Emmett had built with his own hands, Caroline felt a contentment she'd never known was possible. "No more sleeping in sheds," Emmett said, pulling her close. "No more sleeping alone," she countered. The yellow dog, now officially theirs, curled up on a rug by the fireplace. Through the window, Caroline could see the lights of Dustwell twinkling in the distance. Her clinic, her town, her life. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" she asked. "You, broken on the prairie. Me, lost and unwanted. 2 broken people," he mused. "Good thing broken bones heal stronger, isn't it?" "Yes," she agreed, thinking of all the breaks that had brought them here. Broken dreams, broken hearts, broken bones, all of them mending into something stronger than before. Good thing indeed. As spring turned to summer, Caroline received another letter from Denver, another offer. She didn't even open it before feeding it to the stove. Her life was here now, in this small house with this good man, in the clinic where she served her community, in the town that had learned to see past its prejudices. She thought sometimes about writing to Sarah, Daniel's sweetheart, to tell her that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for in all those wandering years, that helping others hadn't just been penance for the one she couldn't save. It had become her path to redemption, to love, to home. But some things were better lived than written. One evening, as she and Emmett sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, he took her hand, the one wearing his promise ring. "Any regrets?" he asked, as he often did. "Only one," she said. He looked at her in surprise. "What?" "That it took me so long to find you." He laughed, pulling her close. "Worth the wait, though." "Worth everything," she assured him. The yellow dog barked at something in the distance, probably rabbits, and the evening breeze carried the sound of children playing in town. Somewhere, a mother was calling her family to dinner. Somewhere, a father was coming home from work. Somewhere, life was happening in all its ordinary, extraordinary glory. And here, on this porch, two people who had been lost had found themselves in each other. The woman who'd been unwanted had become essential. The cowboy who'd been broken had become whole. Together, they'd built something that neither could have imagined when this story began. A life, a love, a future. Not just this once, but always. Not despite their brokenness, but because of it. Not perfect, but theirs. And that, Caroline thought as she leaned into Emmett's warmth while the stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Caroline and Emmett's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Please share in the comments where you're listening from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world and hearing your thoughts on these frontier tales. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help more people discover these authentic stories of love and redemption in the American frontier. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing these historical romances to life. Until next time, partners.